Hi, everyone. I hope you're enjoying your summer. This week's Parsha is Parshat Eikev, the third Parsha in Sefer Devarim. And in eighth grade, we learn Sefer Devarim. And one of the things I used to always do when teaching Sefer Devarim is I would frame it as Moshe's last speech. I'm not the only one who does that. That's Moshe's last speech. And I actually called it his last lecture, and I'll show you why in a moment. But it's really this opportunity for Moshe in Sefer Devarim to speak to Bnei Israel and his final moments with them. He's been journeying with them for 40 years. Um, he knows what their history in Egypt, and he wants to send them off to Eretz Israel in a way that, because he can't be there, that they have everything they need to know. So I kind of compare it to, let's say you have a child who graduated high school, did their year in Israel, let's say, and they're going to college. And not that the child isn't going to come back home, but it's their last time fully living at home full time the way they used to. And maybe that parent wants to send their child off in a way that like gives them all the final things. Maybe it's advice on past experiences, like, knowing that child and saying like, just want to remind you like to be patient for people, to listen to other people's opinions, whatever is like those final messages. Maybe there's some new advice, like, you're going to be in a college where you're in a setting with people of different religions and backgrounds, and you had in your high school and academy experience. So I'm giving you advice for those kind of settings. And whether it's old or new, the parent wants to send that child off into college with all the advice they can get before they go. And that's like my final send off. Now, it's not exactly the same with Moshe Rabbeinu, because hopefully in the college example, child comes home and you're revisited with your parents, and you could WhatsApp and text, and you're not really apart from the parent. In the same way as with Moshe, it is a real send off. It is a last lecture, because whatever messages Moshe wants to give to Bnei Israel, this is really his final opportunity, because there is no texting afterwards. This is Moshe's end. At the end of Sefer Devarim, that the Moshe is the final goodbye. And so Moshe wants to, in Sefer Devarim, go over some old advice, some old things that happened in their past, and some new things. So in this week's Parsha, that's exactly what Moshe does. Reviews some old things, reviews the sin of Cheda Egel, reminds them of that mistake, and reminds them of the mistake of Korach, reminds them of the mistake of the Meraglim, which is not their generation, but to remind them that those mistakes had happened from your people and from your family, and has prevented us from greatness. And so in order to achieve greatness, we need to learn from those mistakes. I don't think it's one of those things where Moshe is just new, like remember those mistakes just to rub it in our faces, but it's the idea of reminding Bnei Israel of the past so that we can learn from it. Right? It's not like we don't have to ignore or regret our mistakes, but we have to learn from them. And that's what Bnei Israel had to do as a nation for their entry into Eretz Canaan at the end of Sefer Dvarim. And Moshe, doesn't only talk about our mistakes and our past, reminds us of what is to come. What is that forward step? And going into Eretz Canaan, we're told that in this week's Parsha, one of the many times, it's an Eretz Zavat Chalav Udvash. It's a land flowing with milk and honey. We're reminded of the Sheva Minim, the seven species, Eretz Chita Saora, Geffen Te'ena, Rimon, Shemen, Zayit, and Dvash. So we're reminded of those seven species that are special to Eretz Israel, and we'll get those if we do good. The second paragraph, Shema, is also mentioned in this week's Parsha. V'haya, that's this week's Parsha, continuation of the Ahafta. If we do good and we love God, then good things will happen to us. And unfortunately, if we don't do good, then bad will happen. And you could feel this energy in the Parsha where Moshe just wants to really like just anything I can give you. I don't know if any of you went to sleepaway camp and you're back from sleepaway camp, and I don't know if your parents gave you those like before you got on the bus messages, kind of like my college example of like, or maybe if you go away for Shabbat and your parents just try to like, don't forget to say please and thank you, and don't leave the mess, and don't be too loud. Like it's all the things you want to get in. That's all the things that Moshe wants to get in. And so the reason I call it the last lecture is I actually stole that phrase from a university called Carnegie Mellon. And they have a tradition where the professors would give a last lecture. If you had one last lecture to give, what would that be? And that really reminds me of Moshe's farewell, Moshe's goodbye in Devarim. It's really the same thing, right? Like, what would your Sefer Devarim moment be if you had to give a Sefer Devarim moment? So if you had a last lecture, and there's a famous last lecture that's given, we're not going to watch the whole thing, but I wanted to show you what it is, and you can look it up yourselves if you want. But there is a man named Randy Pouch. He unfortunately passed away. And he was a professor at the University of Carnegie Mellon, and he was diagnosed with cancer, I believe, and unfortunately it was terminal. And so he actually gave a last lecture. And in 8th grade, I always show this at the beginning of the year to show the power of a last lecture and to frame Sefer Devarim in this way.
So I'm reprising a talk that I gave in September at Carnegie Mellon University. There's an academic tradition called the last lecture. Hypothetically, if you knew you were going to die and you had one last lecture, what would you say to your students? Well, for me, there's an elephant in the room. And the elephant in the room is that for me, it wasn't hypothetical. I've been fighting pancreatic cancer. It has now come back after surgery, chemotherapy, and radiation. And the doctors tell me there's nothing more to do and I have months to live. I have 3 little kids. Let's be clear, this stinks. But I can't do anything about the fact that I'm going to die. I'm pursuing medical treatments, but I pretty much know how this movie's going to end. And I can't control the cards I'm dealt, just how I play the hands. Now, if I'm not morose enough for you, I'm sorry to disappoint, but I don't choose to be an object of pity. And in fact, although I'm going to die soon, I'm actually physically very strong. In fact, I'm probably physically stronger than most of the people in this audience.
So he goes on to give over, this is on the Oprah show. So he did it like in 2.5 minutes as opposed to a longer lecture. And you can look it up yourselves on YouTube. But he gives, what would his final message be? It's very inspiring. And unfortunately, he did not survive. And that's kind of like the message I feel of Moshe. Moshe can't change his reality, and he knows he can't change his reality. This is his last lecture, and he's choosing to live the most he can and to give over the messages that he can. And that's what I feel in that paragraph of Shema of V'haya. And that's what I feel all over the Parsha of Eikev. So think about that as you read through the Parsha, and I wish you a Shabbat Shalom.